Imagine standing on the edge of a deadly cliff, waves crashing violently beneath you, shadows lurking behind the windows of a haunted mansion. Then suddenly, a scream cuts through the stormy night. But this time, even Hercule Poirot is unsure if he can solve it. Hold your breath, because this case will haunt you forever. The sea churned with a restless fury, its dark waves slamming against the jagged cliffs of Whispering Isle like a beast gnashing its teeth. The wind howled through the twisted pines, carrying the scent of salt and something more elusive, something ancient, foreboding. Overhead, thunder rumbled, a promise of the storm yet to come. A lone ferry, its hull battered by the relentless spray, groaned as it reached the dock, ropes straining as if resisting the arrival of its passengers. Among them, a small man stepped forward with precise, deliberate movements, his bowler hat perched perfectly, his impeccable mustache unswayed by the merciless wind. Hercule Poirot was not a man accustomed to chaos, yet as he descended onto the narrow stone jetty, an unshakable sense of unease settled over him. The invitation had come 3 days prior, simple, elegant, yet cryptic. "Monsieur Poirot, you must come to Whispering Isle this weekend. It is a matter of utmost importance. I fear time is short. S. Felix Harcourt." No explanation, just urgency. As Poirot adjusted his coat against the biting wind, his sharp eyes swept over the island. The cliffs rose like jagged ribs of a long-dead creature, crumbling into the abyss below, and at the island's highest point, Harcourt Manor loomed, its towering glass windows reflecting the last streaks of a dying sun. A house of modern luxury, yet cold, lifeless like a mausoleum watching over the sea. A figure stood at the entrance, waiting, her silk scarf twisted in the wind, her deep navy coat stark against the pale stone. Lady Genevieve Harcourt, the second wife of the enigmatic Felix Harcourt, stepped forward as Poirot approached, offering a warm yet calculated smile. "Monsieur Poirot," she greeted, her voice smooth as silk. "Welcome to Whispering Isle. I trust your journey wasn't too unsettling." Poirot studied her with quiet amusement before bowing slightly and taking her offered hand. "Not at all, madame," he replied. "Although she is in a most terrible mood today. I do hope it does not signify a storm of equal ferocity within these walls." For the briefest moment, something flickered in her gaze, a hesitation, a whisper of unease before vanishing just as quickly. "Let us hope not," she said softly. "Do come in. You must be cold." As Poirot stepped inside, the grand entrance of Harcourt Manor enveloped him. The marble floors gleamed beneath the glow of an immense chandelier, its crystal teardrops refracting the light into ghostly prisms. The air was warm, yet carried a strange, oppressive weight, like a room that had held too many secrets, too many whispered conversations. A butler appeared soundlessly, taking Poirot's coat and suitcase before vanishing as swiftly as he had come. "You are the last to arrive," Lady Genevieve continued, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she led him deeper into the house. Poirot's sharp gaze flickered around the space. Something about this place felt unfinished, not in structure, but in spirit. The silence was not the quiet of peace, but of something waiting to be disturbed. And Poirot, ever the observer, knew one thing for certain: this house was not just a place of wealth and luxury, it was a place of secrets. Secrets that, before the weekend was over, might very well turn deadly. As Poirot followed Lady Genevieve through the grand corridors of Harcourt Manor, the air seemed to thicken with an unspoken weight. The walls, adorned with ancestral portraits and modern art that clashed in silent discord, seemed to watch his every step. The only sound was the soft click of Lady Genevieve's heels against the polished marble floor. "Everyone else is in the drawing room," she said, her voice composed but with an edge of something Poirot could not yet place. "Sir Felix will join us shortly. He's been occupied." She hesitated, her lips lingering on the word, as though searching for a better one. Poirot, ever the observer, did not press her, but he carefully filed away that moment of hesitation in the recesses of his mind. They reached the double doors of the drawing room, which were slightly ajar, allowing a murmur of conversation to spill into the hallway. But the moment Lady Genevieve led Poirot inside, the chatter ceased as if someone had cut a string. The room was a masterpiece of elegance, a grand space with high ceilings, an opulent chandelier that cast flickering light over the polished wooden floors, and a massive fireplace where logs crackled, fighting against the chill creeping in from outside. An array of deep leather armchairs circled a low glass table, the air heavy with the mingling scents of tea, expensive perfume, and the faintest trace of cigar smoke. 4 sets of eyes turned toward him. The silence was not one of hostility, but of curiosity, curiosity tinged with something darker. Suspicion, perhaps. Lady Genevieve, recovering quickly, broke the silence with practiced grace. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Monsieur Hercule Poirot. He will be joining us for the weekend." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in a rumpled shirt smeared with faint streaks of paint, unfolded himself from one of the armchairs with an air of lazy amusement. His dark hair was unruly, his expression one of faint mockery. "The famous detective," he said, his tone edged with something unreadable. "I've read about you." He extended a hand. "Bernard Harcourt, Sir Felix's son." "A pleasure, monsieur," Poirot responded, shaking the young man's hand. His grip was firm, but Poirot noted the tension that ran through his fingers, the slight clench of his jaw. This was a man who carried grievances, though whether they were against his father or something or someone else, Poirot had yet to determine. One by one, the other guests introduced themselves. Camilla Sinclair, Sir Felix's personal secretary, was a woman of sharp intelligence, impeccable posture, and cool efficiency. But as she greeted Poirot, her eyes flickered something brief, something buried. Resentment, perhaps. Dr. Arthur Winslow, a family friend, had a warm smile and an air of easy charm, but there was something preoccupied about him, as if his mind was weighed down by an invisible burden. Lavinia March, a distant cousin and a successful novelist, sat poised on the edge of her chair, watching Poirot with an appraising gaze that was as sharp as the pen she wielded. She sipped her tea slowly, but Poirot had no doubt she missed nothing. And then there was Captain Geoffrey Abbott, a former naval officer and Sir Felix's longtime business partner. His face was weathered, the lines on his brow carved deep, as though he had braved more than just storms at sea. His handshake was strong, his stare unreadable. As Poirot exchanged pleasantries, his sharp eyes flickered from one face to the next, cataloging the subtle tensions threading through the room like an intricate web. The way Camilla Sinclair deliberately avoided Bernard's gaze, the way Lady Genevieve clutched her pearl necklace when Captain Abbott spoke, the way Dr. Winslow's fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of his chair, as if some unspoken thought gnawed at him. The butler arrived with a silver tray, setting down cups of steaming tea and delicate biscuits. The gentle clinking of porcelain against saucers provided a momentary illusion of civility, but the undercurrents of something far less polite remained. Bernard Harcourt, his gaze piercing, leaned forward slightly. "I understand my father invited you personally," he said, his voice calm but probing. "Did he tell you why?" Poirot met his stare evenly. "Non, monsieur. His letter was brief. It merely stated that my presence was required." "Curious," Lavinia March murmured, running a finger along the rim of her teacup. "Felix isn't the type to extend invitations without a reason." "Indeed," Poirot agreed, his gaze shifting toward Lady Genevieve. "Perhaps Sir Felix will enlighten us when he joins the party." Lady Genevieve's hand trembled slightly as she placed her teacup back onto its saucer. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Poirot noticed. He noticed everything. "Yes," she said, a touch too quickly. "I'm sure he will. He's just attending to some last-minute business." The conversation drifted toward lighter topics: travel, literature, business affairs, but Poirot listened with half an ear, his mind occupied with what lay beneath the surface. These people were not merely guests gathered for a pleasant weekend. They were bound by something deeper, something complicated. Family, business, betrayal, secrets, cliffhanger. And then a scream tore through the house. Sharp, piercing, filled with terror. The teacups rattled as Lady Genevieve gasped, rising abruptly from her seat. Bernard's smirk vanished. Camilla's eyes widened in horror. Poirot was already standing. His heartbeat remained steady, his mind sharpening. He had expected the storm to break. It seemed it had just begun. A heavy silence hung in the air as Lady Genevieve's departure left an unspoken unease among the guests. Some retreated to their rooms. Others wandered through the house in uneasy contemplation, but no one could shake the peculiar weight of Sir Felix's absence. It was not just lateness. It was something else, something left unsaid. Poirot, however, remained by the grand fireplace, his sharp eyes flickering in the dim glow of the flames, his mind already dissecting the puzzle unfolding before him. He had been invited here for a reason, and though he did not yet know why, he could feel the first whispers of an answer forming in the shadows. Outside, the storm gathered strength, the wind howling through the trees like a restless spirit. Poirot turned to the window, watching the angry sea thrash against the cliffs, its foamy crests illuminated by sporadic flashes of lightning. The sky was a vast, brooding canvas of dark clouds, heavy with the weight of an impending tempest. But as Poirot stood there, listening to the distant crash of the waves, it was not the storm outside that unsettled him, it was the one brewing within these very walls. "There is a storm inside this house as well," he murmured to himself, his reflection faint in the glass, "and I fear it will break soon." As if in answer, the mantel clock struck 8. The chime echoed through the vast chamber, its solemn toll cutting through the hush like an omen. Poirot stirred, his gaze shifting toward the grand doorway where Lady Genevieve had disappeared earlier. His instincts, honed through years of untangling the darkest mysteries, whispered to him that Sir Felix's absence was no simple coincidence. The wind battered against the windows with renewed force, rattling the panes, as Poirot exhaled and straightened his posture. With precise movements, he adjusted his lapels, smoothing the front of his jacket with a meticulous touch. "It is time," he murmured, "time to uncover what secrets this house seeks to hide." But even the greatest detective must rest. With one final glance at the fire, Poirot ascended the grand staircase, his footsteps soft against the thick carpet, as he made his way to his assigned room. There, he carefully unpacked his belongings with his usual fastidiousness before lying down. But sleep did not come easily. Questions spun in his mind, forming threads of mystery that begged to be unraveled. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind shrieking past the windows like an unseen warning. And then, finally, sleep took him. The morning after. Morning arrived at Whispering Isle, cloaked in an oppressive gloom. The storm had passed, but the sky remained thick with heavy, lingering clouds, as if reluctant to release its grip on the house. The air smelled of damp earth and sea salt, the wind still whispering through the cliffs, though its fury had faded to a restless murmur. The manor stirred to life, slowly, servants moving about, doors opening and closing in the distance, the clinking of china as breakfast was served. But the illusion of tranquility did not last. The stillness was shattered by hurried footsteps pounding down the corridor. Camilla Sinclair, her face drained of color, burst into the drawing room, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table for support. Her voice, though breathless, carried an unmistakable urgency. "Sir Felix is missing." A hush fell over the room. The air, already thick with unspoken tension, became suffocating. Lady Genevieve, seated at the breakfast table, nearly dropped her teacup. The delicate porcelain clattered against the saucer as she set it down with unsteady hands and rose to her feet, her expression shifting from confusion to something dangerously close to panic. "Empty. What do you mean, Camilla? Where could he have gone?" Camilla swallowed hard. "The window was open," she whispered. "Facing the sea. You must see it for yourselves." Bernard Harcourt, lounging in the corner, lifted his cigarette lazily to his lips, his expression unreadable. He exhaled a slow curl of smoke before murmuring, "Well, that's inconvenient." Poirot, who had been silently observing the morning's events unfold, set his cup down with precision and rose. His dark eyes, sharp as ever, met Camilla's. "If you would lead us there, mademoiselle," he said gently. A procession of wary guests followed, as Camilla led the way up the grand staircase, the tension thickening with every step. The air in the corridor was stifling despite the lingering chill of the storm. The silence was oppressive. Only the soft thud of their footsteps against the thick carpet broke it. Sir Felix's door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. As they entered the room, Poirot's sharp gaze took in everything at once. The space was deceptively undisturbed, the bed was perfectly made, the furniture untouched. A small reading lamp still cast a dim glow, as though it had burned through the night. And then there was the window. It yawned wide open, curtains billowing wildly in the morning breeze. Camilla, standing near the threshold, swallowed hard. "He's gone," she whispered. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze flicking over the scene with practiced precision. The storm had left behind a sheen of moisture on the wooden floor beneath the window. A single glass from the bedside table had been knocked over, an isolated disruption in an otherwise eerily undisturbed space, and outside, beyond the open window, the sea churned restlessly beneath the jagged cliffs. Lady Genevieve exhaled sharply, one hand flying to the pearls at her throat. "No," she murmured, almost to herself. "He wouldn't have." But Bernard, ever the cynic, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Wouldn't he?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward, placing a careful hand on the windowsill, leaning out just enough to see below. The cliffs stretched downward in a sheer, unforgiving drop. The rocks far below jutted out like jagged teeth, waves breaking against them in an endless, merciless assault. And then he saw it. A single footprint, damp, faint, and leading towards the very edge. Poirot straightened, his expression unreadable, but his voice was calm, measured. "I fear," he said at last, "Sir Felix is not merely missing." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, each one frozen in varying degrees of shock and dread. "I fear he has been taken." And in the stunned silence that followed, outside, the wind howled once more. A vanishing in the night. The dramatic view of the sea beyond framed the open window like a portrait of restless turmoil. The morning light, feeble and cold, barely pierced through the heavy storm clouds lingering over Whispering Isle. Lady Genevieve stood frozen in the doorway, one hand clutching the frame for support, her face pale as though drained of all warmth. The very idea was unthinkable. "Felix wouldn't have left in the middle of the night," she said, her voice uneven, thick with distress. "He hated the cold. This does not make sense." Her words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered, but Poirot remained composed. He stepped forward with measured grace, his sharp gaze moving across the scene with meticulous precision. "Nevertheless, madame," he murmured, "we must consider all possibilities. The open window is indeed peculiar." A rustling near the window caught his attention. Commodore Hastings pointed toward the small side table near the curtains. "His walking stick," Hastings muttered. "It's missing." A ripple of unease passed through the group. Felix never went anywhere without his walking stick. It was not just a habit, it was a necessity. A weighted silence settled over the room until Captain Geoffrey Abbott broke it with reluctant urgency. "We should search the cliffs," he said. He hesitated, then added, "If the window was open, he could have." He trailed off, unwilling to voice the dark possibility that loomed over them all. "Let us not assume the worst just yet," Poirot interjected, his voice steady, controlled. "We will search, of course. But first, I wish to examine the room." Lady Genevieve swallowed hard and stepped back, dabbing at her eyes with a trembling handkerchief. Poirot moved methodically, his eyes scanning the room with hawk-like precision. The bed untouched, the nightstand a few personal items neatly arranged. But there, amidst the order, was something wrong. A broken porcelain figurine. Its shattered pieces lay scattered across the surface, as if someone had tried to hurriedly sweep them aside but abandoned the task halfway. Poirot picked up one of the larger fragments, rolling it between his fingers. "A recent break, I think," he murmured, his tone thoughtful. His mind was already at work, piecing together the first strands of a mystery unraveling before him. "Madame Aurore," he said, turning toward the housekeeper, Did Sir Felix often sleep with his window open? The woman shook her head firmly. Never. He was particular about drafts, always complained if the room wasn't perfectly warm. Poirot's eyes flickered with intrigue. Interesting, he said under his breath. Something was not right. He knelt beside the window, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the frame. There, caught in the latch, was something small, almost imperceptible. He plucked it free and held it up to the light. A piece of silk. Soft, torn, delicate. Carefully, Poirot folded the fragment and slipped it into his pocket. "What have you found?" asked Lavinia March, who had been observing Poirot's every movement with intense curiosity. He straightened, offering her a small, knowing smile. "A clue, perhaps," he replied enigmatically. Poirot turned back to the window, leaning slightly forward to examine the ground below. Something wasn't right. No footprints. The damp soil, still soft from the night's rain, should have preserved any trace of movement. If Sir Felix had climbed out or been forced out, there would be footprints. But there were none. Captain Abbott furrowed his brow. "Could he have fallen further out?" he asked, "closer to the cliffs?" Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps," he allowed, though his expression suggested he was not convinced. A sudden cry from outside shattered the stillness. The group turned sharply as Bernard Harcourt appeared in the doorway, his face tight with grim urgency. "Camilla found his walking stick," he announced, "near the edge of the cliffs." Lady Genevieve gasped, her composure crumbling entirely. She staggered slightly, gripping the edge of a chair for support. "No," she whispered, "he can't be." Poirot placed a steadying hand on her arm. "We do not know anything for certain yet, madam," he said gently, but firmly. "I will go to the cliffs myself." A hush fell over the group. No one spoke, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. Then, one by one, they followed Poirot outside. The cliffs. The wind was brutal, biting at their faces as they made their way toward the edge of the cliffs. The grass was still wet, slick beneath their feet. The scent of salt and damp earth filled the air, mingling with the distant roar of waves crashing against jagged rocks below. Camilla Sinclair stood motionless near the precipice, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to ward off a deep inner chill. At her feet lay the missing walking stick. It was half buried in the damp grass, positioned precariously near the cliff's edge. Poirot bent down, lifting it carefully. The polished wood was slick with moisture, but something caught his eye, a faint streak of red along the handle. "It's his," Camilla whispered. "I'm sure of it." Poirot turned the stick over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Blood, or something else. Lady Genevieve sobbed quietly, her gloved hands pressed to her lips. The sea below churned violently, its relentless waves crashing against the jagged rocks far below. The thought was unbearable. Had Sir Felix? Poirot took a slow step closer to the cliff's edge. He peered down, his sharp eyes scanning the treacherous descent. No body, no torn fabric, no sign of a fall. Only the endless swirling sea. He turned back to the group, his mind already calculating, assembling, realizing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "I do not believe Sir Felix fell." A flicker of something passed through the group: confusion, disbelief, hope. Poirot's gaze darkened slightly. He turned the walking stick in his hands once more, then looked out at the roaring sea. "I believe he was taken." A fresh gust of wind howled through the cliffs as the weight of his words settled over them. And somewhere, beyond the relentless waves, the truth waited to be uncovered. Clues on the cliffs. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, its eerie wail a ghostly lament. Salt-laden air bit at their faces as the group moved carefully over the uneven terrain. The waves below crashed violently against the rocks, white foam rising like phantom hands reaching for the shore. Then Camilla Sinclair gasped. Snagged on a sharp outcrop of stone, flapping wildly in the wind, was a dark overcoat. Sir Felix's overcoat. A chill ran down her spine as she clutched her arms. "His coat," she whispered, barely able to say the words aloud. "But where is he?" Poirot stepped forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he inspected the garment. The lining was torn, damp from the relentless spray of the sea. Carefully he knelt, slipping his gloved hand into the pocket. His fingers closed around something small and crumpled. A receipt. Unfolding it with meticulous precision, he scanned the details. "Ah," he murmured, his voice unreadable. Captain Abbott, impatient as ever, leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" Poirot held up the receipt for them to see. "A purchase," he said simply. "A pearl necklace, very expensive, dated 2 days prior." A hush fell over the group. "Pearls?" Camilla echoed, frowning. "For whom?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket. His mind was already turning, weaving together the threads of this deepening mystery. Captain Abbott let out a slow, measured breath and turned toward the edge of the cliffs. The waves churned restlessly below, a merciless abyss. If he fell from the cliffs, his body could be anywhere by now, he said grimly. Poirot's gaze lingered on the crashing sea, but his expression remained enigmatic. "Perhaps," he said, his tone neutral. He turned then, his attention shifting away from the violent ocean to the distant lighthouse, standing stark and weather-beaten against the storm-heavy sky. "Let us speak to the lighthouse keeper," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "He may have seen something." A locked door. They reached the lighthouse soon after, its whitewashed walls streaked with years of brine and decay. Captain Abbott tried the door. It did not budge. "Locked," he muttered, rattling the handle. Poirot considered this for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly against his chin. Then he nodded, as though some unseen thought had just confirmed itself. "Very well," he said. "We will return later if needed." But his sharp eyes lingered on the door a moment longer before he turned away. Nearby, nestled against the cliffs, stood a small, weathered cottage home to the lighthouse keeper, Mr. Finlay. They approached the door, and after a brief hesitation, Captain Abbott knocked firmly. A moment later, it swung open, revealing a man with a face as craggy as the cliffs themselves. His skin was tanned and leathery, his beard scruffy and salt-streaked. He squinted at them with wary suspicion, a permanent frown carved into his forehead. "Strange folk coming round on a morning like this," he muttered, his voice thick with a seaman's rasp. "What do you want?" Poirot took a measured step forward. "We are looking for Sir Felix Harcourt," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "He is missing. We believe he may have come this way last night. Did you see anything unusual?" Finlay scratched his stubbled chin, his squint deepening. "Aye," he admitted after a moment. "I saw someone, heading toward the cliffs, late last night." A gust of wind rattled the shutters, filling the silence that followed. "Who?" Bernard Harcourt asked sharply. Finlay shook his head. "Couldn't say. Too dark. And the rain, it was coming down thick." He paused, then added, "But whoever it was, they were moving fast, like they didn't want to be seen." Poirot's expression did not change, but his fingers tapped lightly against his sleeve, as if counting the beats of an unseen rhythm. "And you did not investigate, monsieur?" The lighthouse keeper scoffed. "Not my business," he said with a shrug. "People come and go on this island as they please. I don't ask questions." There was a silence. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the doorframe, a reminder of the untamed world beyond. Dr. Arthur Winslow shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "It could have been Felix," he said quietly. "He's been under tremendous stress. His business dealings there were complications. It wouldn't surprise me if he..." He stopped abruptly, as though he had just realized he had said too much. Bernard's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "Suicide." Dr. Winslow flinched, his face paling. "That's what you're implying, isn't it, Doctor?" Bernard pressed, his eyes dark and accusing. "That my father jumped." Dr. Winslow's jaw tightened. "I'm only saying it's a possibility," he muttered. "Felix was not a man without troubles." Aurori, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Her voice was thoughtful, measured. "And yet," she mused, "a man burdened by such troubles might confide in someone. Did Sir Felix share his concerns with you, Doctor?" Winslow hesitated, his fingers twitched at his sides. Not directly, he said at last, avoiding Poirot's gaze. But I knew enough. Everyone did. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "Mercy, doctor," he said simply. Then he turned toward the door. "We have learned much this morning," he murmured, "and yet we are no closer to the truth." They stepped back outside, where the wind continued its relentless assault on the cliffs. The mystery of Sir Felix's disappearance had only deepened, and Poirot knew this was only the beginning. Secrets in the shadows. Lavinia March hesitated, fingers tightening around the notebook she clutched. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw someone sneaking out of the manor last night," she confessed. Poirot's gaze sharpened. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes as if echoing the unease in the room. "Go on, mademoiselle," he urged gently. Lavinia swallowed hard. "I was by the window in the library when I noticed a figure slipping through the side door. I couldn't tell who it was, but they were headed toward the cliffs." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And why did you not mention this earlier, mademoiselle?" Lavinia looked away, color rising in her cheeks. I wasn't sure it was important," she murmured, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. Poirot watched her for a long moment, his mind already piecing together possibilities. Finally, he nodded. "Très bien. Let us see if your sighting holds significance." The gathering. Back at the manor, the group reconvened in the drawing room, where the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Lady Genevieve sat by the window, her face pale and unreadable, staring out at the turbulent sea. She turned as they entered, her gaze lingering on Poirot before shifting to her son Bernard. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Camilla Sinclair, standing near the fire, answered in a hushed tone. "His coat," she said, "and a receipt for a pearl necklace." The effect was immediate. Lady Genevieve's hand flew to her throat, her expression tightening. But she said nothing. Poirot, ever observant, cleared his throat and turned to Camilla. "You have been quiet, mademoiselle," he noted. "I understand Sir Felix recently threatened to dismiss you from your position. Is that true?" A sharp intake of breath. Camilla's eyes widened, and for a fleeting moment she looked ready to deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a sigh. "Yes," she admitted. "Why?" Poirot's tone was mild, but there was an edge of insistence beneath it. Camilla's fingers tightened into fists at her sides. "He found out about a mistake I made with the company finances, a mistake that could have cost him a great deal of money. I tried to fix it, but he said it was too late. He was planning to fire me after this weekend." "And yet you stayed," Poirot observed. Camilla looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to explain myself. I wanted him to understand that it wasn't betrayal, just a mistake, but he wouldn't listen." Poirot tilted his head, considering. "Curious," he murmured thoughtfully. "The sketchbook." He turned then, his attention shifting to Bernard, who lounged near the fireplace, a sketchbook resting casually in his hands. The firelight cast shadows across his face, but the flicker of something amusement perhaps lingered in his dark eyes. "And you, monsieur?" Poirot asked smoothly. "What did you do last night?" Bernard smirked. "I went to bed early, like a good boy." Poirot's gaze flicked to the sketchbook. "May I see that?" For the first time, Bernard hesitated. His fingers curled slightly around the leather-bound book, as though considering refusing. Then, with a careless shrug, he handed it over. "Suit yourself." Poirot flipped through the pages with deliberate precision, his expression unreadable. The drawings were impressive detailed, lifelike. But then he stopped. A page, a series of sketches. Sir Felix, drawn in various humiliating situations. One of them, Poirot's brow lifted ever so slightly. It depicted Sir Felix tumbling off a cliff. A slow exhale settled over the room as everyone stared at the image. Poirot closed the sketchbook with a soft thump and handed it back. "You have a vivid imagination, monsieur," he observed dryly. Bernard leaned back against the chair, unbothered. "Don't read too much into it," he said with a smirk. "It's just a way to vent." A tense silence followed. Poirot said nothing, only turning toward the window, his sharp mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. The fire crackled behind him, casting long shadows across the walls. Lavinia's account of the figure sneaking out. Camilla's confession about her impending dismissal. The pearl necklace purchased mere days before Sir Felix vanished. He inhaled slowly, watching the heavy curtains sway slightly as the wind pressed against the glass. One must be careful when dealing with lies, he thought, for they are like threads pulled on one, and the entire fabric unravels. Turning back to the assembled group, Poirot allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Mes amis, the mystery begins to reveal itself. N'est-ce pas?" he said smoothly. "I believe we are closer to understanding what happened to Sir Felix." But he glanced around the room, his voice lowering ever so slightly. "There is still more to uncover. The truth, it seems, is hiding just beneath the surface." The wind outside howled, rattling the windows once more. And somewhere, within this very room, lay the answer to Sir Felix Harcourt's fate. The flickering shadows danced across the room, but the warmth of the hearth did little to dispel the cold tension hanging in the air. Lady Genevieve sat stiffly in an armchair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Across from her, Bernard Harcourt leaned against the marble mantelpiece, tapping the ash from his cigarette into a crystal tray, his expression unreadable. Camilla Sinclair perched on the very edge of a velvet sofa, her back ramrod straight, as if poised to flee at any moment. Near the window, Lavinia March scribbled feverishly into her notebook, her keen eyes darting across the room, capturing every twitch, every unspoken word. And then there was Poirot seated near the fire, hands steepled, his sharp gaze sweeping over them all. He was the quiet observer, waiting for the cracks to widen, for the hidden truths to seep through. The silence stretched taut, until Bernard finally broke it, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Convenient, isn't it?" He flicked his gaze toward Lady Genevieve, his smirk barely concealed. "Father vanishes, and who benefits the most? The charming young widow, of course." Genevieve's face flushed an angry crimson, and she shot up from her chair, her eyes blazing. "How dare you, Bernard? I loved your father despite his flaws. I would never wish him harm." "Loved him," Bernard scoffed, taking a slow drag of his cigarette. "Let's not pretend, shall we? You married him for his money. Everyone here knows it. And now that he's conveniently disappeared, you inherit everything. How fortunate for you." "Enough," Poirot interjected, his voice calm yet firm. "Accusations, mon ami, are dangerous things when they lack proof. Perhaps, instead, we should consider another possibility: your own relationship with your father. It was hardly one of harmony, was it?" Bernard pushed himself off the mantel, a dry laugh escaping him. "Of course, we had our differences. He was a tyrant, controlling and manipulative. But do you really think I'd waste my time killing him? He wasn't worth the effort." "And yet," Camilla cut in, her voice edged with steel, "your sketches suggest otherwise." Poirot turned his attention to the sketchbook Bernard had been clutching earlier. Inside, detailed drawings of Sir Felix were scrawled across the pages, mocking, grotesque caricatures of a man brought to ruin. One image in particular caught Poirot's attention. It depicted Sir Felix tumbling from a cliff, his coat flaring behind him. "You've thought about it plenty," Camilla said coldly. Bernard's smirk faltered. His fingers tightened around his cigarette before he exhaled slowly. "And what about you, Camilla?" he countered. "Father found out you were siphoning money from the company, didn't he? He was going to fire you. Maybe you decided to strike first." A sharp intake of breath. Camilla's eyes flashed with anger and something else, fear. "Enough." Lady Genevieve's voice rang through the room as she stood, trembling, but her chin lifted high. "We are tearing each other apart. None of this will bring Felix back. Monsieur Poirot, please, you must help us." Poirot rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "But of course, madame, I intend to. However, first I must understand the full picture." The conversation fizzled into uneasy silence. Lavinia's pen scratched furiously against the paper, her notebook filling with observations. Poirot watched her closely. What had she seen that others had missed? Later that night, long after the household had retreated to their rooms, Poirot moved silently through the dimly lit corridors of Harcourt Manor. Something was nagging at his minda ripple in the web of deception, something just out of reach. The wind howled as he stepped outside, the chill biting through his coat. He kept to the shadows, moving with careful, deliberate steps toward the cliffs, and then, in the distance, he saw it. A lone figure shrouded in darkness, moving swiftly toward the rocky edge. "Ah," Poirot murmured to himself, his sharp eyes narrowing. "La curiosité me guide." His pace quickened. The night was far from over. Poirot moved like a shadow, his steps light, his breath measured as he drew closer to the edge of the cliffs. The waves crashed below, their roar muffled by the night wind, but his focus was on the two figures standing under the cold gaze of the moon. Lady Genevieve. The silver light revealed her pale face, her lips parted in surprise. Beside her stood Captain Geoffrey Abbott, his posture stiff, his expression a mask of tension. He, too, had not expected to be caught. "A clandestine rendezvous, is it not?" Poirot said smoothly, stepping forward. His voice was soft, but it carried, cutting through the hush of the night like a blade. One cannot help but wonder, what would Sir Felix think? Genevieve's breath hitched. She instinctively clutched Abbott's arm, as if seeking support or protection. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, her voice unsteady. "We were just talking." Poirot's gaze flicked between them, noting the rigidity in Abbott's stance, the tight grip of Genevieve's fingers on his sleeve. "Ah, but of course," Poirot mused, his tone deceptively light. "Talking, in the dead of night, by the cliffs, far from the warmth of the manor. A most peculiar choice of location, madam. Perhaps you would enlighten me as to the nature of this conversation." Captain Abbott exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You may as well tell him, Genevieve," he muttered. "He already knows too much." Genevieve hesitated, her gaze dropping to the damp earth beneath her feet. When she spoke, her voice was laced with something more than sadness resignation. "Felix knew about us," she admitted. "About my past relationship with Geoffrey." Her grip on Abbott's sleeve tightened. "It ended before I married Felix, but he never forgave me. He held it over me like a noose, always reminding me that I was beholden to him, that I was trapped." Poirot watched her carefully. "And now that Sir Felix is gone, madam, you are free, yes?" His voice was gentle, but probing. "I didn't kill him," she burst out, her eyes wild with emotion. "I swear it. I may have hated the way he controlled me, but I never wished him dead." Poirot let the silence stretch for a moment before turning his attention to Captain Abbott. "And you, mon cher capitaine, were you here to discuss the past, or perhaps the future?" Abbott's jaw tightened. He held Poirot's gaze, but there was a flicker of something: guilt, anger, fear. "Felix threatened to ruin me," Abbott admitted at last. "He had information about my business dealings, about things that would have destroyed my reputation. He wanted me out of Genevieve's life entirely, but I didn't kill him." Poirot tilted his head. "Then tell me, mon capitaine, if you are so certain Felix is dead, why did you meet here tonight to discuss what you would do if he returned?" Genevieve sucked in a sharp breath. Abbott flinched, his fists clenching at his sides. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Genevieve whispered. Poirot reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object. In the moonlight, it gleamed: a gold cufflink, elegant yet simple, its surface catching the light like a tiny star. "Tell me, Captain," Poirot said softly, "is this yours?" Abbott's face paled. "Where did you find that?" he demanded. "Near the cliffs," Poirot replied smoothly. "Close to where we now stand." Abbott's gaze darted toward the ground, his stance shifting. Genevieve turned to him, her grip tightening. "Geoffrey, please," she pleaded. "If you know something, if there's anything you're hiding." "I don't," he snapped, jerking his arm free. "I lost that cufflink days ago. Anyone could have found it." Poirot watched him for a moment, then, without another word, slipped the cufflink back into his pocket. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes held something: suspicion, certainty, an unspoken conclusion forming in his mind. "Perhaps," Poirot murmured, "but there is more, mes amis." He reached into his other pocket and produced a small, charred fragment of paper. The edges were burnt, as though someone had tried to destroy it, but faint words were still visible. "The lighthouse. A debt to be paid." Genevieve gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Felix had debts," she whispered. "Debts, madame," Poirot said gravely. "Or perhaps obligations of another kind." He turned the fragment over between his fingers. "The meaning of this letter remains unclear for now." The wind howled again, a restless force stirring the sea below. Poirot pulled his coat tighter around himself and turned toward the manor, gesturing for them to follow. "Let us return inside, where it is warm," he said simply. "The night air is not kind to those with heavy hearts." As they made their way back through the darkened gardens, Poirot's mind worked tirelessly. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but something was still missing, the key to it all. And Poirot would find it. The game was not yet over. Secrets uncovered. Morning broke cold and gray, the sea still restless from the night's storm. But it was not the weather that chilled the inhabitants of Harcourt Manor. It was the discovery made just after breakfast that sent a shudder rippling through the house. The drawing-room doors flew open with a bang. Camilla Sinclair stood in the threshold, her face pale as milk, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Miss Poirot," she choked out, clutching the doorframe for support. "Sir Felix's body. They found it." The room seemed to freeze. A hush fell, suffocating and heavy. Poirot, who had been calmly stirring a lump of sugar into his tea, set his cup down with deliberate care and stood. "Where?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. "The lighthouse cellar," Camilla whispered. "It was locked, but someone broke in." A sharp intake of breath from behind. Lady Genevieve gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles bone-white. Bernard Harcourt exchanged a glance with Lavinia March, who, in an uncharacteristic gesture, snapped her notebook shut without writing a single word. Within minutes they reached the lighthouse, its white tower rising against the dull morning sky like a ghostly sentinel. The air was thick with salt and dampness, the sea's distant roar punctuating the silence. Captain Geoffrey Abbott and Dr. Arthur Winslow waited at the base of the structure. Abbott's face was grim, his jaw clenched. Winslow's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "The body is inside," Abbott said quietly, pushing open the heavy wooden door. A damp, musty scent rushed out, mingling with something heavier, the unmistakable copper tang of blood. A lantern swayed from a rusted hook, its feeble glow barely illuminating the stone steps that led downward. Poirot descended carefully. The air grew colder. Then he saw it. Sir Felix Harcourt lay crumpled beneath a pile of tangled fishing nets. His overcoat was damp, his head tilted at a grotesque angle. A deep gash marred his temple, dark blood crusting the wound. His face pale, rigid, frozen in a final moment of terror. Poirot inhaled slowly, eyes flicking across the cellar. Nothing was out of place, except for the body. He crouched down. Something wasn't right. He murmured, tilting his head. He did not fall. Dr. Winslow swallowed hard, then knelt beside the body, his fingers probing around the wound. His voice was reluctant. "No, he was struck first. This injury's the cause of death. Judging by the stiffness, he's been dead since around midnight." Midnight. A single word, but it set everything in motion. Poirot's gaze swept the room. His eyes landed on something, the glimpse of red beneath the fishing nets. He reached out and carefully pulled it free. A blood-stained handkerchief, and embroidered in gold thread were the initials, G.A. The room's temperature seemed to plummet. Poirot turned the handkerchief over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to Captain Abbott. "This is yours, is it not?" A heartbeat of silence. Abbott's face darkened. "I don't know how it got there," he said, stiffly. "I haven't seen that handkerchief in days." "Perhaps," Pooh murmured, slipping it into his pocket. "And this door." He gestured toward the cellar's entrance. Was it forced? Yes. Abbott exhaled sharply. The lock was broken when we arrived, but as far as I know, only the lighthouse keeper and Sir Felix had keys. Curiouser and curiouser, Poirot muttered, more to himself than anyone else. A faint sound behind him, a sharp intake of breath. Lady Genevieve stood near the entrance, her face ashen, her lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "please, you must return to the house. This scene is not for you." For a moment, she did not move. Then Bernard stepped forward and took her arm, guiding her away. When the others had gone, Poirot turned back to the body. A puzzle was forming, but the final piece was still missing. With a careful hand, he reached into Sir Felix's coat pocket. His fingers brushed against something paper. He pulled it free and unfolded it. The other half of the letter he had recovered from the fireplace. It was now complete. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he read the words aloud, his voice a whisper that barely stirred the heavy air. "Meet me at the lighthouse. Midnight. The debt must be paid." And suddenly the entire game changed. The tolling bell. The debt? Poirot straightened, his mind working rapidly. What debt? Who did Sir Felix owe? And more importantly, to whom? As he turned to leave the cold, damp cellar, the door creaked open. Lavinia March appeared, standing in the doorway, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Poirot studied her for a moment. Her face was calm, but her fingers were trembling. "Perhaps, mademoiselle," he said at last. "Earlier you mentioned overhearing Sir Felix recite a poem. Do you remember it?" She nodded, flipping through her notebook with careful precision until she found the right page. The lines had already been written in her neat script. "Yes, it was strange," she admitted. "I overheard him in the library muttering to himself just yesterday. I noted it down in my diary." She took a steadying breath and read aloud. "The keeper waits where shadows dwell. Upon the shore, a tolling bell. The debt is paid when blood is spilled, and secrets buried shall be fulfilled." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. It means a great deal, mademoiselle." Lavinia frowned. "You recognize it?" "This is no idle recitation," Poirot murmured. "It is a riddle, one that speaks of betrayal and hidden truths." Lavinia hesitated, gripping her notebook tighter. "Do you think he knew he was going to die?" she whispered. Poirot's gaze flickered toward the body one last time. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "Or perhaps he intended to confront the one who held this debt over him." Either way, it did not end as he expected. The gathering. They returned to the manor, where Poirot gathered the household in the drawing room. The tension in the air was palpable. Lady Genevieve sat stiffly on the chaise lounge, her hands gripping the armrests as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. Bernard Harcourt stood near the window, staring out into the storm, while Captain Abbott kept his arms crossed, his jaw set tight. Lavinia March sat near the fireplace, her notebook resting in her lap, though for once her pen was motionless. The storm outside had returned with renewed fury. Wind rattled the windows, and rain lashed against the glass like ghostly fingers. Poirot stood by the fire, his dark eyes sweeping over them all. He was close now. "Let us consider what we know, mes amis," he began, his voice smooth, measured. "Sir Felix did not fall by accident. He was lured to the lighthouse, struck on the head, and left to die. The handkerchief, the letter, the forced Durich clue points to a deliberate act." Camilla Sinclair exhaled sharply, her voice breaking the silence. "Then who did it?" Poirot allowed the question to linger, watching their reactions. A flicker of unease in Captain Abbott's eyes. Lady Genevieve's fingers tightening around the fabric of her gown. Bernard Harcourt shifting his weight from foot to foot. The pressure was working. Poirot smiled faintly. "Patience, mademoiselle," he said. "We are close. But the final revelation requires one more piece of the puzzle." As he spoke, a flash of lightning illuminated the room and, for a split second, The shifting shadows on the walls seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The truth, Poirot knew, was lurking in those shadows, waiting to be drawn into the light. He exhaled slowly. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow, the final thread shall be pulled and the entire tapestry will be revealed." The final thread. The morning after Sir Felix's body had been discovered, the household vibrated with an almost tangible tension. Rain pattered against the windows, the dull, rhythmic sound filling the uneasy silence of Harcourt Manor. The sea's distant, thunderous crash was a constant reminder of what had transpired the night before. Poirot sat alone in the drawing room, his coffee steaming on the table beside him, his eyes half closed as he reviewed the timeline in his mind. Monday Sir Hastings, he murmured to himself, would call this a classic riddle of alibis, when everyone claims to be everywhere and yet no one is where they should be. He had spent much of the early morning analyzing the conflicting accounts given by the guests. Bernard Harker had claimed to have been sketching by the cliffs during the storm. Lady Genevieve insisted she had been in her room, too distraught by Sir Felix's disappearance to leave. Camilla Sinclair said she had retired early, citing exhaustion. And Captain Abbott, his alibi was as vague as it was unconvincing, simply that he had been walking the grounds. Poirot drummed his fingers against the polished wood of the table. There is a thread of truth hidden among the lies, he thought, but I must pull gently, lest it snap. His gaze flicked toward the clock on the mantel. It was time. He summoned Camilla Sinclair first. She entered hesitantly, smoothing her dress with nervous hands before lowering herself into the chair opposite him. Poirot regarded her for a long moment before speaking. "Mademoiselle," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "I have been told that Sir Felix intended to dismiss you from his employ. Would you care to elaborate on why?" A flash of fear, a hesitation, and then a single drop of sweat rolled down the side of Camilla's face. Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly. "You see, mademoiselle," he continued, "I believe that his decision was not merely one of business." He saw the flicker in her gaze, the tightening of her fingers. He smiled. Yes, the thread was pulling tighter, and soon it would unravel completely. Shadows of the lighthouse. The interrogations. Camilla Sinclair sat stiffly in the high-backed chair across from Poirot, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the manor windows, a dull, rhythmic sound that only seemed to heighten the suffocating tension in the room. The flickering glow of the fireplace cast long, restless shadows on the walls. Poirot, seated with perfect composure, studied her careful as eyes, sharp and calculating, missing nothing. "You were to be dismissed, were you not, mademoiselle?" His voice was gentle, but his words held weight. Camilla swallowed hard, her gaze darting to the window, avoiding his piercing stare. "It was a misunderstanding," she whispered. "There were discrepancies in the company accounts, and Sir Felix believed I had been embezzling money." Her voice hitched slightly, and she inhaled a shaky breath before continuing. "But I swear to you, I wasn't stealing. It was an error in bookkeeping. A mistake, yes, but not a crime." Poirot leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "And yet," he said softly, "you did not correct this misunderstanding before his death." Camilla's jaw tightened. "I tried," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "But Sir Felix wouldn't listen. He accused me, threatened to ruin my career. I had no choice but to stay, and hope I could convince him." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his voice almost sympathetic. "And did you convince him, mademoiselle? Or," he paused, letting the moment stretch between them, "did you see his death as the end of your troubles?" A flicker of anger crossed Camilla's face, her pale cheeks flushing red. "I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot. I was in my room all night. You can ask the maid. She brought me tea before bed." Poirot's lips curled in the barest hint of a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Ah, but the maid saw you early in the evening," he pointed out, "not later. And you see, mademoiselle, there are footprints leading from the lighthouse toward the servants' quarters, footprints in the wet, heavy mud. Someone walked that path in the dead of night." His voice lowered, his eyes locked onto hers. "Was it you?" Camilla's breath came in shallow gasps. "No," she whispered. "I swear it wasn't me." Poirot studied her for a long moment before dismissing her with a small, precise wave of his hand. "We shall see, mademoiselle. We shall see." Lady Genevieve's secret. The next to enter was Lady Genevieve. She moved slowly, her steps hesitant, her face pale and drawn. Her normally poised demeanor was gone, replaced by exhaustion and something deeper, fear. Poirot gestured for her to sit. "Madam, I know this has been a great strain upon you," he said gently. "But I must ask you, have said you remained in your room all night. Are you certain?" Genevieve's lips trembled, but she composed herself. "Yes," she said firmly. "I couldn't bear to see anyone after Felix disappeared. I was overwhelmed." Poirot nodded, as if considering this. Then he said, almost conversationally, "And yet, your fear of being implicated must weigh heavily upon you." He let the words settle, watching her reaction. "You had a motive, madam. Sir Felix knew of your past indiscretions. He used them to control you. Were you not desperate to be free of him?" Genevieve gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I didn't kill him," she cried, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was afraid but I would never." Poirot cut her off, his voice deceptively mild. "Did you know about the blackmail letter?" Genevieve froze. "What letter?" Poirot leaned back slightly, watching her carefully. "There is a hidden compartment in Sir Felix's desk," he explained. "Inside, I found a letter threatening to expose a scandal. It is unsigned, but it speaks of a debt owed and the possibility of ruin." Genevieve's breath hitched. "No," she whispered. "I didn't know." Poirot studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "That will be all for now, madame." Bernard Harcourt, the defiant artist. Finally, Bernard Harcourt entered the room. He walked in with the same air of nonchalance that he always carried, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his expression bored. He slumped into the chair, stretching his legs out lazily, as though the entire ordeal was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. Poirot's eyes twinkled with something unreadable as he regarded the young man. "Monsieur Bernard," he began, "you claim to have been sketching by the cliffs during the storm. Tell me, what exactly were you sketching?" Bernard exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "The waves," he said lazily. "The cliffs, the storm." It was dramatic. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And you expect me to believe that you ventured out into a raging storm simply to capture nature's drama?" Bernard smirked. "Believe what you want," he said with a shrug. "I didn't kill him." Poirot rose from his chair and walked toward the window. Rain streaked the glass, the storm outside still raging. He clasped his hands behind his back, staring out into the darkened landscape. "You see, Monsieur Harcourt, the truth is a peculiar thing," he murmured. "It has a way of revealing itself, even when one attempts to bury it beneath a flood of lies." He turned back slowly, his gaze now sharp, his voice colder. "And I believe, monsieur, that the truth is very near indeed." A flicker of something perhaps unease crossed Bernard's face, but just as quickly it was gone. Poirot smiled, but there was steel in his voice as he said, "We shall continue tomorrow." A sudden crash of thunder rattled the windows, and the room plunged into uneasy silence. The storm outside raged on, but Poirot knew the real storm was just beginning. Shadows of the lighthouse, the final unraveling. The storm had passed. Gone were the howling winds and lashing rain that had battered the cliffs through the night. Now, in the golden light of morning, the jagged rocks below the lighthouse glistened with moisture, their surfaces dark and treacherous. The sea, once violent and wild, had calmed to a deceptive stillness. Inside Harcourt Manor, however, the storm was far from over. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the grand drawing room, his small, immaculate figure a stark contrast to the weight of the moment. His eyes, keen and unreadable, swept across the assembled guests, each one tense, each one knowing that this was the moment of reckoning. Lady Genevieve sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her usual grace and elegance now betraying a restless unease. Bernard Harcourt slouched in his chair, feigning disinterest, though his fingers drummed anxiously against his thigh. Camilla Sinclair, pale as the morning mist, gripped the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Captain Abbott stood stiffly, his jaw set. Dr. Winslow and Lavinia March remained silent observers, their expressions unreadable. The room was thick with tension, as though the very walls held their breath. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but commanding. The mechanism of deceit. Mes amis, Poirot began, his tone almost conversational. We have arrived at the conclusion of our little drama. Each of you has secrets, each of you has motives, and each of you has presented an alibi that, upon first glance, might suggest innocence. He paused, letting his words settle. But alibis, like the gears of a clock, must work together seamlessly. And yet, there is a broken cog in this machine that causes the entire mechanism to fail. And when the machine fails, the truth is laid bare. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Poirot turned sharply, his sharp gaze locking onto Lady Genevieve. Lady Genevieve's fear. Madame, he said smoothly, you feared Sir Felix would expose your past indiscretions. He held power over you, did he not? Genevieve's hands trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin, her voice steady. He had his hold over me, yes, but I did not kill him. Poirot inclined his head. No, madame, you did not. Your fear made you cautious, not murderous. A breathless silence followed. Then Poirot turned his attention to Captain Abbott. The false clue. And you, Captain, he continued, his tone light, as though discussing the weather. A handkerchief embroidered with your initials was found at the crime scene. A careless mistake. Captain Abbott stiffened. Two didn't leave it there. None, Poirot agreed. You did not, because it was placed there deliberately to mislead us. The captain's shoulders sagged in relief, but Poirot was already moving on. Bernard Harcourt. A dangerous imagination. He turned next to Bernard Harcourt. The young man's bored expression did little to mask the tension in his posture. Monsieur Bernard, Poirot said smoothly, you despised your father. And your sketches, those dark, unsettling images of a figure tumbling from the cliffs, were not merely idle fantasies. They were reflections of your deepest desires, were they not? Bernard shot up from his chair legs scraping against the polished floor. I didn't act on them, he snapped. I couldn't have. Poirot remained unruffled. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. And yet, how do you explain the faint trail of mud leading from the cliffs to the servants' quarters? The color drained from Bernard's face. I don't know, he stammered. Poirot's voice turned firm, pressing forward like a knife cutting through the lies. You do know, monsieur. But the question remains, are you the murderer, or are you merely protecting someone? Bernard clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. His silence was damning. Poirot watched him for a long moment before turning away, dismissing him. The unraveling of lies. He moved to the fireplace, his gaze distant, his mind weaving the threads of deception together into a clear picture. The alibis, he murmured, more to himself than to the others. They are like clockwork gears, mes amis. If I find the broken cog, the entire mechanism will collapse. The room was utterly still, every eye locked onto him. Poirot turned sharply, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver through the room. And now, we come to the final thread. He took a step forward, his gaze settling on Camilla Sinclair. She had been quiet throughout, gripping the armrest of her chair, her breathing shallow. Now, as Poirot fixed his eyes upon her, a tremor ran through her frame. He spoke gently. Mademoiselle Sinclair, shall we discuss the truth? A hush fell over the room. Camilla's fingers tightened around the chair, as though she could anchor herself. But Poirot saw it, the subtle shake in her hands, the slight quiver in her lip. Poirot took a slow step toward her. You had everything to lose, did you not? His voice was soft, almost coaxing. Sir Felix had accused you of theft. He was ready to ruin your career. He would never let you escape unscathed. And so, mademoiselle, what did you do? Camilla swallowed hard. I told you, I was in my room. Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. None, mademoiselle. That is what you want me to believe. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot turned, pacing leisurely. The letter found in Sir Felix's desk, the blackmail letter, it spoke of a debt owed, of someone being forced into a desperate situation. And who, I ask you, was more desperate than you, mademoiselle? Camilla's face was deathly pale. Poirot suddenly stopped and looked directly at her. The footprints, he murmured, leading from the lighthouse to the servants' quarters, were yours, were they not? Camilla's breath hitched. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried through the silent room like a blade slicing through silk. Tell me, mademoiselle, how did it feel, knowing that with one push, your troubles would be over? A strangled sound escaped her lips. And then, the room exploded into chaos. Shadows of the lighthouse. The final reckoning. The silence in the grand drawing room was suffocating. All eyes were on Camilla Sinclair. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. A slight tremor ran through her hands as she clutched the arms of her chair. But she said nothing. Poirot stood before her, his presence both unassuming and inescapable. His eyes, sharp and knowing, never wavered. The time has come, mademoiselle. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of finality. Camilla's lips parted slightly, but no words came. You had the motive, Poirot continued, stepping forward. Sir Felix discovered your embezzlement, did he not? A betrayal that could have ruined your career and your life. When he confronted you, he did not offer mercy. No, he threatened you. He was going to expose you, publicly destroy you. You knew there would be no redemption, no second chances. And then, there was the opportunity. Camilla's nails dug into the fabric of the chair. You were trusted, mademoiselle, Poirot said softly, yet his words cut like a scalpel. Trusted enough to arrange the meeting at the lighthouse, a meeting where Sir Felix believed he held the upper hand. But instead, Poirot let the words hang, the silence stretching unbearably. Camilla's breath hitched. A single tear slipped down her cheek. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. I didn't plan to kill him. The words, though quiet, shattered the room like glass. Poirot did not react, merely watching her with the patience of a hunter waiting for his prey to tire. It just happened. Camilla continued, her voice raw. I want to explain myself, to beg him not to report me, but he laughed. He said I was finished, that no one would ever hire me again. He said I was nothing. Her voice cracked, her body shook. I panicked. Poirot exhaled softly. Oui, mademoiselle. And in that moment of desperation you reached for whatever you could find. A paperweight perhaps. A lantern. Something heavy enough. Hard enough. Camilla squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could block out the memory. I didn't think I just swung. And then he was falling. There was so much blood. There couldn't stop it. Her sobs filled the air, raw and broken. Poirot, ever composed, gave a small nod. But your panic did not end there, none. No, you knew that a mere accident would not erase suspicion. You needed to cover your tracks. You forced the lighthouse door open to make it appear as though a stranger had broken in. You planted Captain Abbott's handkerchief at the scene, hoping the evidence would lead us away from you. And then, his voice dropped, almost a whisper. You shattered the figurine. Camilla's breath caught in her throat. Poirot tilted his head. A gift from Sir Felix, one you despised. In your anger, you smashed it, but in your haste, you forgot one thing. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a single shard of porcelain, glistening under the light. You left behind the pieces. Camilla's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Your perfume, mademoiselle, Poirot added, his tone almost gentle now. A faint but unmistakable trace of your signature scent lingered in Sir Felix's room. A scent only he and a few others would recognize. That combined with the footprints, the broken figurine, the forged evidence. Poirot exhaled slowly. It was you, mademoiselle. From the beginning, it was always you. The room was deathly silent. Camilla raised her tear-streaked face. Her voice was barely audible, a whisper of a broken soul. "He left me no choice." Poirot's expression did not change. "No, mademoiselle," he said softly. "You chose, and now you must face justice." The aftermath. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Lady Genevieve let out a quiet sob, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Bernard Harcourt stared at Camilla, betrayal and disbelief written across his face. Captain Abbott exhaled heavily, shaking his head. Dr. Winslow made a small movement, as if to speak, but Poirot lifted a hand. "There is no more to say, doctor." His voice was quiet, yet resolute. "The truth has been revealed, and the authorities will be here shortly." Two uniformed constables entered the room, their presence a cold and unwavering force of the law. Camilla did not resist as they led her away. Her sobs echoed down the corridor, fading into the distance. Poirot stood still for a long moment, gazing out the window. Beyond the cliffs, the sea stretched endlessly calm, untroubled, as if the storm had never come at all. "Justice," Poirot murmured, steepling his fingers. "It cannot undo the past, but it restores balance to the present, and in that balance, perhaps, we find peace." The final departure. 2 days later, the guests of Harcourt Manor began to depart. The tension that had once suffocated the grand house had lifted, yet its echoes still lingered in the air. Lady Genevieve withdrew to the family's country estate, seeking solace in isolation. Bernard returned to London, though his once bold sketches had taken on a somber, haunted tone. At the jetty, Poirot stood with his compact suitcase by his side, waiting for the ferry. Lavinia March, the last to leave, approached him. "You solved the mystery, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. "But do you never tire of uncovering such darkness?" Poirot turned to her, a faint smile touching his lips. "Non, mademoiselle. For where there is darkness, there must also be light. The trick is in finding it." The ferry pulled away from the island, the cliffs of Whispering Isle fading into the distance. Yet, the weight of its secrets remained etched into the memories of those who had lived through them. Poirot gazed out at the endless expanse of the sea. It was calm now, stretching far beyond the horizon. And like the tides, he knew, the truth will always find its way back to shore.